thanks everybody who is present in person and everybody who is present across the internet from around the world. Today we're going to be talking about some surprising things you can do with open source, and by surprising I mean in the enterprise world. I know we've had a discussion with a few of the people in the room about hacking home automation and things like that. I'm really going to be talking about business things you can do with open source. So first things first, shameless and obligatory plug to my company and myself. I'm Gilles Gravier. It's one of those tricky French names. I'm based out of Geneva, Switzerland, actually. I work for a company called Wipro. We're a global system integrator with about 20,000+ people specializing in open source out of our 200,000 people workforce. We're present in the open source world in over 25 different foundations. We have a huge internal community. It says 2,500+, but it's actually more like 5,000 now. And for example, in the Kubernetes environment, we're the 128th highest ranking contributor, just to give you an idea. We're a member of a bunch of open source foundations, including Linux Foundation. We're on the board of directors of Finos. We're a member of Hygieia. We're a member of OSDU. OSDU, if you don't know it, it's kind of obscure. It's Open Subsurface Data Universe. It's for the petroleum industry. They're trying to build best practices for sharing document formats and source code and things like that. LF working. We're a member of OpenChain. We're actually the first system integrator partner of OpenChain. So that's just to give a few ideas. And that's it about talking about the company I work for. You're not here for that. So we're going to talk about what are the benefits of doing, and by doing, I mean using, contributing, and or publishing open source in an organization. So not just using. But what are the benefits of doing open source in the enterprise? And I will alternate the word enterprise and organization. And if I say enterprise, it doesn't have to be a business enterprise. Some things apply to governments and things like that. So a lot of people get into the open source space because of a perceived cost benefit. It's free, so I'm going to save money, which often is a mistake, because the money you save on license costs tends to be, compensated on integration costs, support costs, training costs, etc. But anyway, that's how a lot of companies start looking, or organizations start looking at open source. It's going to save them money. Those who stick with open source for more than a few months actually do that for other kind of benefits. And these 5 ones that I've listed here are some of the main ones that our customers actually mention to us when we talk to them about their open source activities. The first one is pace of innovation. And I will detail some of them later, so I won't talk too much about these. Normally, when I present this, I spend half an hour on each of these talking about examples, but the whole point of this presentation is these examples, so I will talk about the examples later. So pace of innovation. How good, and the quality of innovation, how good it is and how fast it goes. Fail fast, which works well with the Facebook story. Move fast, break things, fail fast, start again. And that's also useful from the cost perspective, since you don't have to pay licenses to do stuff and try things. It doesn't cost a lot, and you don't have a long procurement cycle, so you can go fast. Zero-day productivity is an example that came from a bank customer of ours. It was a play on the expression zero-day vulnerability, but here it's more of a positive thing. When you hire a developer, they're immediately efficient on technologies they contribute to. Developer centricity, I'll talk about how it's used by companies, and visibility and thought leadership. I'll give a few examples of how this is done. So this is basically what I'm going to be talking about in my in the next 10 or so slides. Do we all still call them slides, right? But they're not slides anymore. Screens, whatever. So let's look a little bit more in details in some of these benefits and incredible things you can do. And the first one, it's the obligatory joke here, is with open source, you can travel to all things open to do cool presentations, and I'm really grateful for that. This is my second presentation since after the COVID lockdown. I'm still amazed that I'm able to be here. I was here in Raleigh in 2019 for the previous edition in person. Actually, when I turned on my laptop, it couldn't connect to the Wi-Fi network, and it was behaving strangely, like it was trying to connect and not working. And then I said, okay, I'll reconfigure the connection, and I realized that it was still using the old ATO 2019 exclamation mark password, which was confusing the hell out of it. So anyway, it's great to be back here, and open source is a great way for communities to get together and talk together and travel and meet. That said, let's get back to some more serious benefits. First, I'll start by defining what primary and secondary innovation mean. Primary innovation is when you innovate, when you create some really, really fancy technology that nobody else has done. And secondary innovation is when you benefit from somebody else's primary innovation. So when you're using open source projects, typically you're benefiting from secondary innovation because these open source projects tend to be developed by organizations, groups, communities that are extremely diverse. And we had a whole diversity day yesterday, but the diversity I'm looking at here is country. You have people from around the world participating on a single project. Gender, obviously, you have as many genders as people want to identify with. Cultural diversity, and anything you want to add. Those are just examples, but those are the main ones. And the thing is that because of this diversity, you get a whole bunch of ideas that if you were looking at a commercial project or a commercial product, you wouldn't have. Commercial products innovation is often dictated by marketing, or if you're lucky, by some internal innovation team, skunkworks, something like that. But the problem with these organizations and the way they do innovation is they're thinking inside their box. They try to think outside the box, but they're really inside the box doing the I'm trying to think outside the box thing. The only way to think outside the box is to have people who are outside the box doing the thinking for you. And that's what happens when you bring people from outside, typically contributors to an open source project or community that you're using. So to put it in other words, Bill Joy, sorry, that is really, really bad lapsus. Bill Joy, one of the co-founders of Sun Microsystems, a company I used to work for over a decade ago, once said something. He said, innovation happens elsewhere. And that's exactly what it means. You can't innovate well from inside your organization. You have to have innovation coming from the outside. Open source is an amazing place to do this because communities, people will, contribute to your projects from the outside. If it's interesting, that's a whole different story. Another interesting aspect in terms of innovation is open innovation. Who's familiar with open innovation, what it means? So the whole point of open innovation is having multiple entities working together on something innovative. And these entities could be competitors trying to create a common standards, for example, banks who have to work on a payment mechanism or payment protocol or API, or they could be partners that need to develop a common thing that they both need. So open innovation is getting these people that are from different organizations cooperating together to innovate. Normally, lawyers get involved because you have to get in place, you have to get NDAs in place, and you have to define the perimeter of the IP you need to protect, and you have to work on the duration of this and liability if things go wrong. It's a mess. It literally is a mess. With open source, it's really, really simple. You basically write an initial piece of code, you put it on GitHub or wherever you want to put it, GitLab or something else, and you put in place a license and a contributor license agreement so people know what terms they're contributing on, and that's it. Anybody can contribute. Your users, your partners, your competitors, your employees, anybody. And that's immediately creating an open source, an open innovation model. In fact, a lawyer that I work with who specializes in open source once told me, I hate open source. He was joking, obviously. He told me, I hate open source because people do open innovation without having to hire us to put in place all these complex structures. It sucks, big time. So, but it really is that. If you want to do open innovation, it works really well. And in fact, there was a Austrian insurance company called Allianz. I don't know if you know the company Allianz, big guys. A couple of years ago, few years ago, couple is British for two, few years ago, they open sourced 6 million lines of code of their insurance backbone software. And they published it. They actually created a foundation for that. And they published it. And in their press release, they basically said, we want our competitors who we sell this stuff to normally, because it's a common infrastructure for all the insurance companies. We want our competitors to actually help us make this better and more featureful and more useful and less bugs and more innovative. So let's all innovate together on this thing. And that was it. They didn't have to get lawyers involved or anything like that. They just published the code and said, go ahead. So innovation, whether it is open innovation or just the old style innovation, is super interesting when you're looking at open source. If you have an innovation team in your organization, head of innovation or somebody like that, you have to talk to them about open source. Raised hand. So the question is, when organization put out open source, put out code as open source, it might come with a whole bunch of different licenses that you have to check. Oh, okay. And the licensing is there to prevent competitors from taking the code. Actually, the licensing is there to say how competitors can take the code, not to prevent it. Which reminds me, by the way, a fun story. When I was in China presenting Open Solaris to the government, somebody from the government walked up to me one day and said, aren't you afraid that people, of course, that people will steal your software? And I said, no, you can't steal our software. We're giving it to you. It's here. Go ahead, take it. You can't steal it from us. The license basically says, if you're going to use my stuff, this is what you have to do with it. So, and that can be enforced. There's a whole bunch of organizations out there, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the Free Software Foundation, who have lawyers specializing in helping companies that feel that they've been wronged by people taking their code, their open source code, and using it incorrectly, to help them defend that in front of a lawyer. So you select a license based on what you want your users downstream to do with your code, in particular, if they're going to be redistributing it in some modified form or other. So that's what the open source license is all about. Okay. Yeah. So Alliance picked a license, and I don't remember which one it is, for their code that made sense for them given their use. Okay. And that by the way, selecting a license is the object of a completely different talk, but you select your license based on the business case you want for your software. And I'm going to say this here once, it's not the object of this talk, but there is no such thing as an open source business model. There are business models that work or don't work, and some of them work good with open source and others don't. Trying to sell licenses, runtime licenses for open source doesn't work. It is a business model, but it doesn't work with open source. So pick the right business model, figure out how you want to generate revenue or monetize your project and your activities, and select a license that supports that. Another interesting aspect of open source is user centricity. In fact, it goes back to my previous statement about innovation, that it's not innovation that's driven by a marketing service or an internal team. It's innovation that's driven by users, right? Somebody is using the code, your code, and realize that something is wrong, or that it's missing a feature, or that it could benefit from an additional functionality, and they will implement it for you for free. And so it is made by users. It's made by somebody who actually has a need for this stuff, not by somebody who has a crazy idea of, we should put this feature in because that would single us from our competition because they don't have it. Yeah, but nobody wants it. Yeah, but our competition doesn't have it. Yeah, whatever. So in the case of open source, the features get added because people need these features. Nobody's going to waste time implementing something for free if they don't need that something to be implemented. So it's very, very, very user-centric. In fact, there's an insurance company, and this is an internal discussion I had with them, so I'm not going to give too much detail, but there's an insurance company that has as their main mission statement to be the most innovative and user-centric insurance company in their region. And so they were asking me, how can we how can we do that with open source? My main work is helping companies satisfy their business objective with open source. So I said, well, if you take your mobile client as an example, and make it open source, what happens is that your users will actually put stuff in there that makes sense for them, stuff in there that you probably would never have imagined. I don't know, connecting the insurance application with my Facebook community so that I can exchange information with friends and recommend the insurance to them, or whatever. Something that I never would have thought of, but some user that has their own use case for this might have thought of. So you get something that is extremely user-driven, in particular from an innovation perspective. And so with open source, that is almost systematically the case. The project, the open source projects I contributed to were always because I had a need for that. Getting PGP to run on my exotic hardware in the 1990s because I needed to make a purchase by sending an encrypted email to somebody, and it didn't run on my machine, so I couldn't send the email. So I just took the source code, ported it. By the way, that was illegal in France. So it's an anonymous contribution, unfortunately now, but at the time I didn't have much choice. Anyway, so I got it working for me. So it's user centricity. Distributed agile. That's when I like, and that works for open source as well as for inner source. Anybody here not know what inner source is? Everybody does. Good. So the idea here is that when you're doing agile, you do your projects, and I'm not an agile specialist, by the way, but my teams basically told me this is how it works. And so agile works, teams work in sprints, and sprints take place in a room together with a bunch of people working intensely on something. And the problem is that if you have a large distributed organization, you can't do a sprint across multiple countries. It doesn't work well. So typically what you do is it's not easy. But if you are using open source or inner source, you have centralized code repositories, and each team that is working on specific features, wherever they are, can work in local sprints on the part they're working on, and as they would a contribution to a certain feature of a project or a product. So you basically but you actually leverage the silos for doing distributed development by having local sprints distributed across multiple countries. And so one of the banks that I work with, it's a British bank actually, sorry, European, not really from the European Union anymore, but European continent, sorta, is doing that now. It does bring some interesting issues when you're doing that. As a German car manufacturer realized, the European legislation for tax on software or on hardware actually depends on where the stuff is manufactured. So when you have a team in Belgium, a team in Germany, a team in France, and a team in Hungary working on the same on blocks of code of the same project, it's really hard to figure out where to tax the software that's being developed, especially because then it gets integrated into a German car. So it brings some interesting challenges, but it definitely helps a whole organization that's working in an agile mode do that in a distributed way. And that actually leads me to the next slide, which is resilience. The idea of resilience is that because your teams are used to working in a dematerialized environment, in a decentralized environment, sometimes from their homes, sometimes from a smaller office or rented office or etc. In case there is something really bad happening, an environmental catastrophe, hey, a pandemic, and people have to be sent home and work from home, well, those who are already working in an open source or inner source type of structure actually work just as well, if not better. In fact, those who are already working that way have their productivity that doesn't change a single bit. And one of the banks, another European, one of state administrations I work with, actually in Switzerland, does exactly that. When they had to send everybody back home, people were already used to working partially from home. They had their laptops set up, their VPN set up, their shared development environment, everything was set up. The GitHub is external anyway, and it didn't slow them down a single bit. They really didn't see the slightest impact on their productivity. Organization that had to go from completely in-house teams working on projects together, that was harder, much harder, and they took a hit, especially those that actually had to to set up new environments. There was a I can't name them, but a big media organization in Europe actually had to send everybody home. And so they said, okay, it's time to turn on the VPN for everybody. So they put everybody on the VPN. Then they realized that they only had VPN licenses for about 30% of the users, which kind of stopped 66 or 70% from working. So then somebody said, oh, but we have another VPN that we can use that has other licenses. So they opened up another 30% licenses, but with a different VPN tool. So people had to first try to log in with one VPN. And if that didn't work, turn it off, log in with a second. What a mess. So they finally got it sorted out, but it took them three months to get to actually be able to work properly distributed. Organizations that are used to doing that, no issue. They just went ahead and didn't look back. And that's really interesting because that builds this resilience in an almost natural way. Again, those who were doing this before didn't have to do anything. It just worked. Talent acquisition and retention, or if you do it back, losing your employees. Open source, and this goes back to Naviata's presentation from Facebook in the room over there about an hour ago. Open source developers, they want to do things that actually matter for them. They will work because it makes sense. Oh yeah, they will work for money too, obviously. I mean, they need to live, but they need enough money to live. They don't need, necessarily millions of dollars, as long as they're happy with what they're doing. It's worse when you look at millennials. The millennials will, join a company if and only if this company lets them use their social network or whatever they used to, and they will resign if they can't do that. Literally, they will. So employers are starting to realize this, and sometimes they're realizing it the hard way. So a few examples I've had. The first one is a bad example, so I will not name the company. They're a Swiss company, a very fancy Swiss company. You all know them. They actually hired a developer to work on Wikipedia, the code for Wikipedia, which they use internally. And the guy was a contributor to Wikipedia. And when he started contributing, he followed the internal process and said, I'm going to contribute this code and blah, blah, blah. And somebody actually said, oh, wait, you can't do that because there's a policy that says you can't contribute to an open source project if we're using it internally because of a risk of conflict of interest, which, by the way, is bullshit, right? Because when you contribute to a project, you submit code, you propose code, and the project's governance model is there to control how this code is going to be accepted, if at all. So you have people who are going to review it. Does it make sense? Is it aligned with our roadmap? Is the code quality aligned with what we're trying to do and what we want to do, et cetera? So you can't force an open source project to use your code. You can propose it. They can find it interesting or not. They will review it. And if they don't like it, they won't use it anyway. So what did the person do when he was told you can't contribute? Anybody has an idea? Exactly. Bye-bye. He resigned. And he joined Wikipedia Foundation. So the guy left a very fancy Swiss salary in a Swiss international company for a nonprofit. Yeah, I'll let you imagine the kind of salary drop he had. He didn't do it for the money. Okay. Now, another example is a German automotive company who lost a developer there. This time he got more money where he went, but the reason for which he left actually is because the processes were so complex that he actually couldn't contribute. It was just so much of a hassle. Every time he wanted to do something, he had to go through hoops and hoops and hoops before he could actually publish a single line of code. So he just got fed up with it and left. And another example is a global system integrator, and I will hide this one because it's us. And we lost one of our really, really good contributors, and not for money, not for policy, but just because he didn't have time to contribute. As a system integrator, all of our employees are put on projects. If those who are not on project, those who are on bench, they're not productive. Usually we don't like that they're not productive, so we try to put them on projects immediately. Unfortunately, when you're on a project, you don't have time to contribute unless the project is doing just that, which happens sometimes, but most cases you don't. So he was finding that he didn't have enough time to contribute. And we were not capable of changing his work allocation to allow him to contribute. And that would have been a benefit for us, actually. So it's a big mistake on our side not to have done that. And we lost him for exactly that reason. So this is actually unfortunately not a good example of how things happen when you mess up. The other way around is what a UK bank, Lloyd's, is doing. And here's a URL to an article. Or what is Société Générale is doing. They have a program at Société Générale called Attract, and I can name them because obviously the URLs are public. So these companies actually use their open source activities to attract cool developers. Lloyd's has a project to attract the best developers in the planet, or at least in UK, through open source, and Société Générale does that as well. There are some internal details which I won't talk about, but one of the things that is obvious here is that every time they go to a physical presentation, they have HR people with them on the booth. Anybody here was at All Things Open 2019? Okay, so you saw that Disney had a booth right there at the entrance, and they had HR people there. That's exactly what I mean. Okay, use your presence, use your open source projects to attract the really cool guys and girls, y'all, as they said yesterday, that, oh yeah, you are all there. So y'all were there. How do you contract that 3 times? Y'all were there. Yeah, I heard that one too. And me not being a native English speaker, some of that was really hard. So anyway, yeah, using open source to attract talent is a really good thing to do. And by the way, that's not too hard. Just make sure that people know what you're doing. Encourage your developers to tweet, to blog, to participate, to make it visible. That's all it takes, because the other developers out there will see what they're doing. They will follow. Make sure you use the right hashtags. Your community manager can guide you there. And it will be really, really, really nice to do. Politics. That's a really cool one. That's one I like a lot. I'm involved in two big projects these days. But the idea is that open source is loved by governments for a bunch of reasons. First of all, it's a great way to educate people, give them talent, skills, which helps them with jobs. Actually, a bunch of years ago, UNESCO and Sun Microsystems, actually, it was a joint program which I participated in, created an IT passport program, which was based on the knowledge and the use of open source technology. And we did that with UNESCO because the open source technologies were accessible to everybody. There was no licensing cost, no software cost. You just download the stuff and you could use it. So universities or schools or education offices in countries, underdeveloped countries, had as much access to the stuff as anybody else from a developed country had. So the passport didn't come with a social divide element of being able to pay for commercial software. It actually had a very inclusive, everybody can use it. It's free, and it's super interesting from a technology and usefulness perspective. The other thing which is interesting is, giving back to citizens. I'm based in Geneva. The canton of Geneva is a republic, but I live in France, which is also a republic. And for those of you who've done Latin in class, republic means res publica, the thing of the public. And so the idea here is that countries that have this kind of structure, and some that don't, like the UK, which is a kingdom, but also behave that way, think that if the citizens funded some project, some government project with the citizens' money, tax, then that project should benefit back to the citizen. So you have companies, organizations, states that actually contribute code back to as published open source, because it's a good way of returning the stuff to the citizens. If you look at the UK, for example, HMRC, that's the British equivalent of the IRS, so the tax. They have a whole portal on GitHub, and they publish open source code. And their main charter for doing this is giving back to the public what the citizens funded. And it's really interesting because if you look at their portal, it basically says, okay, we're publishing all of this. In fact, we publish everything we do as open source, except a few bits here and there that shouldn't be on open source for various reasons. probably the fraud detection algorithms wouldn't be on open source. But everything else is. I think they have like 600 plus open source project active on their GitHub. And they say on their webpage, they say, feel free to look at this stuff. Feel free to learn from it. We're not asking you to contribute to it because that's not the point. But if you want to, feel free to do so. You can do a pull request, whatever. And if you look at the contributors to the most active projects, most of the contributions are from HMRC, which to be expected. Another big part, the other big part actually is from system integrators. So I imagine those are the SIs that are working with HMRC to develop this stuff. And then you have a few contributors from citizens who find that it's important for them to make their tax paying software better. It's like, I want to pay my tax in an easier way, so I'm going to help my government collect my taxes. How cool is that? You have to be British to do that, right? It doesn't work in other countries, I think. But that's what happens, right? So it's not published for citizens to actually contribute to, but citizens do. In Oman, I talked with the government in 2019 during a conference, and they wanted to see if we could use open source to help their employment situation, to help make Oman a more attractive place for startups, enable large organization in Oman, banks, telcos, and petroleum industries and things like that, use open source and have a better local support for open source. So how could they do that? Could open source help with that? And they also wanted to put Oman as the lighthouse for open source in the Gulf region. So we had a bit of a discussion with them. And as a result, we created something called the OSCO, the Open Source Center of Excellence in Oman, to actually do just that. It's aligned with their Oman 2040 national objectives. And it's designed to support the employment, the unemployed. The way it works, one of it is it helps Oman organizations, large organizations, to do projects that involve open source. And it does that by looking at the skills and the technology necessary for a project. So sometimes the technology comes from Oman startups, which we have a mandate to use. And the skills, what we'll do is we'll find Oman citizens that have the basic skills. And if nobody does, then we'll use people from Wipro, obviously, but the priority is finding Oman citizens. We will create a dedicated training program on the technologies and for the skills required for that specific project. And we will put them on the project. So this is super interesting compared to a traditional train and forget model where you train people and then you say, okay, now you've learned how to put, how to set up Kubernetes, bye-bye. And that doesn't help much, actually. But when you actually put them on a project right after, not only do they have a skill, but they actually have experience. And we don't have a mandate to hire them, nor do the companies who work with them on that specific project have that mandate. But it puts a really interesting line on their resume. And that helps a lot finding a job after that. Sometimes they get hired by the company they work with. Sometimes they get hired by Wipro as well. But the point is train and give experience. And the next one, the last one here is a European state administration that I'm working with. And we're creating an open source strategy for them that is there to support the political objectives of that administration. So they have the Republic thing where they want to make sure that the citizens get access to the code that the citizens have paid for. They want to encourage interstate collaboration so that they hope it will actually drive down the costs of IT, but it will also help control the risk which is incurred by working with commercial vendors which might stop selling the product or decide to charge overly for updates or for service. If you're using open source and if you're mutualizing your resources around open source, you control and lower that risk. So all of these are political objectives of that state administration. And the whole point is to create for them an open source strategy that they're also trying to help with the digital divide. So they're creating educational programs around open source technologies. They're creating lists of open source tools they use internally and that they can only recommend other people use. That's not uncommon, by the way. The French government has something called the SILL, SILL, which in French means the Socle interministériel de logiciels libres, which is the inter-ministry reference for free software. So it's a list. You can actually subscribe to their RSS feed, and every time they put a new software there or remove some software, like they remove Mongo because it's not open source anymore, or there's a new version that came out and fixes a bug, the RSS feed gives you an update on this. They keep this list as a spreadsheet, as a website where you can navigate the list. It's really, really useful. And they do that for the ministries, but it's public. So citizens can look at it as well. So that's the state I'm working with is doing something similar, not as fancy, but something similar. So really, really interesting to put, as a political tool as well. So that's one of the nice things about open source and my job. I love that. Thought leadership, and that's probably my last example, is the idea of showing to the world what you're doing with open source. This is something that's really interesting. Every time you're doing open source, you should communicate about what you're doing. Why? First of all, because it doesn't cost a lot of money to tweet, or have somebody tweet about it. But more importantly, if it's open source, it's out there. If it's out there, somebody's going to see it and talk about it. And you don't want that to happen. Well, you do want that to happen, but you want to take control of that communication. So when you have an employee contributing to something, make sure they know that they should, not only they can, but they should communicate about it. And if they need help, get them to talk to the marketing people or to the community manager or whatever. But make sure that you not only contribute, but communicate and drive the communication about it. Then when people will pick it up, they will pick it up with your words instead of their words. And so that communication is then controlled and probably much more beneficial. And that benefits everything I've mentioned earlier, right? Attracting talent because you communicate about what you're doing, the political agenda, because once you communicate, it's a political tool communication, everything. Tell people, it raises awareness, etc. That's what I'm doing today. Basically, I'm here, I'm talking about what Wipro does in open source and how we do it. And that's exactly that. That's what all of you who are speakers here. Who is a speaker in this event? Okay, so 2 of you. So that's what you two are doing today. You're here, you're talking about your activities in open source. You're doing just that. An example that I like a lot is NIBR. Nobody here knows NIBR, right? Anybody know NIBR? No, I'd be surprised. Okay, so NIBR is a division of Novartis. Novartis is a pharmaceutical industry, not really known for being open, okay? Internally, Novartis uses a mix of open source and proprietary. I'm not gonna give those details out because that's their stuff. But externally, their lab, NIBR, is interesting. They have a whole open source page and they publish some really interesting stuff. They have an ontology software, which is a dictionary of terms that they use for storing stuff that they use, so ontology software. But they're also publishing RNA and DNA sequencing code. Now, that's not toys. That's like fancy stuff. And why are they publishing this stuff? And if you go to their GitHub, by the way, nobody contributes to it. So why are they publishing this stuff? They're showing off. They're saying to the world, we're the best at this kind of stuff. Look at what we're doing. They have this really nice webpage. The open source.nibr.com is a really nice webpage. Go have a look at it. And they're really doing that to show off to the world. Okay, so make sure when you're doing that, you communicate. I was at a presentation at FOSS Asia in 2018, and Daimler had a presentation on open source done by Jonas, their open source head of open source. And I don't know for you, but my image of Mercedes is my grandfather's car or my dad's car, and it doesn't have that image of a really fancy car. And then the guy goes on and shows this picture of a Mercedes dashboard of a new car, where it's like one single dashboard, almost like a Tesla, one single dashboard, and then he puts a list of what it's running. And is running NVIDIA, CUDA processors, high-end graphics and AI chips, a high-performance Intel CPU, and all of that running under Linux with gigabytes of RAM and storage. Like, whoa, I didn't know that. And suddenly the image of, Mercedes just like went poof, 21st century, and not my dad's car. And I knew that Mercedes was doing some open source because when my dad bought his car, which is not that generation, but generations before, it came with a CD that listed all of the open source licenses on board. So I knew they had open source there, but I hadn't seen it in a way presented, again, by a company who controlled the presentation agenda for this and who showed this really, really fancy slide, which just put the car on my modern day radar. So make sure you do that. If you're doing open source, communicate about it. Again, it's going to be out there. It's open source. So if it's open source, it's on a GitHub or a public repository somewhere. It's visible. There's no reason not to communicate. The only thing you risk if you don't communicate is that somebody else is going to take control of your communication for you, and you don't want that to happen anyway. So, just kind of as a summary slide, think about, new opportunities around all of these benefits, right? You can modernize your IT portfolio by innovating like crazy. You can be more agile by having resources, people bring ideas in. Those are indirect benefits of what I've mentioned before, right? When your customers, your users bring you ideas, you leapfrog your competition who is still trying to innovate by imagining things in their marketing team. And you can come in with some really cool ideas that make sense. Improve your brand. Again, you're controlling your communication. You're making your brand sexier, more attractive to a completely different population, which you might not have targeted before. Enable cultural exchange. When you have open source communities, you have to make sure that they work culturally, diversely, etc. That's what brings all of the value of those communities. Well, not all, but a significant part of the value. Improving your innovation, I mentioned that as well, and talked a lot about it. Reducing your complexity and risk because you're sharing the risk amongst other participants in your communities, especially if your code is being developed by multiple organizations or shared across organization. And improve the quality and collaboration. So all of these are benefits of what I've mentioned earlier. So when you think about open source, if you're trying to talk to your management about why you should do more open source or why you should do open source, some companies are still trying to figure that out, or figuring out why they should contribute rather than just use, think about these kind of additional benefits. Thank you very much for listening to me, for the question. If there are any other questions, now would be a great time to ask them. Later also, you have my email if you want to get in touch with me. Add me on LinkedIn, follow me by that same name on Twitter. The guy on the photo looks like me, so it's easy to recognize. So thank you very much. If there are no questions, I will be around anyway if there are questions.